Huguette Clark spent the last 20 years of her life in a hospital room she did not need, registered under a false name, paying $829 a day out of her own pocket. She owned $300 million dollars and three mansions maintained for her return. A staff she never met cleaned houses she never visited. What makes a woman with all of that choose a room with no view? The Clark Copper dynasty was one of the richest families Gilded-Age America ever produced. Huguette's father bought a United States Senate seat, built a mansion with 121 rooms on Fifth Avenue, and put his name on the county that holds Las Vegas. She was the last of his bloodline. At 104, she died rich, still holding the fortune, and the money she had kept for close to a century passed not to heirs because there were none, but to lawyers, a court, and a foundation that now opens the doors of a house she refused to enter for 60 years. The Clark Copper line is extinct, not because the money ran out, because the last person who held it stopped living in the world, and the people around her moved in. To understand what she walked away from, start with the man who built it. William Andrews Clark arrived in the Montana Territory during the mining rush and became one of the richest men in America. At his death in 1925, his personal fortune stood at close to $250 million. Adjusted for what the dollar bought in that era, the figure crosses $3.3 billion. Clark was, by that measure, richer than all but a handful of his contemporaries. The fortune he left behind was concentrated in a single family, built to compound across generations, and left to heirs who had done nothing to earn it. Something far stranger than a crash happened. The last heir stopped participating in her own life, and the people closest to her, a private nurse, a lawyer, and an accountant, filled the vacuum that the rest of the world had left empty. Over 20 years, the nurse alone collected close to $32 million in gifts. Her lawyer solicited money from his own client for a personal construction project overseas. After his criminal conviction, the accountant continued managing her finances, and the federal tax bill on unreported transfers exceeded $82 million. William Andrews Clark was born in 1839 in Connellsville, Pennsylvania, the son of Scotch-Irish farmers. As a young man, he taught school. Then he headed west. He arrived in the Montana Territory during the Civil War and discovered that selling supplies to gold miners paid better than digging for gold. Eggs that cost 20 cents back east went for $3 at the camps. A pound and a half of tobacco bought for $1.50 sold for $6 on the frontier. Clark saw the equation and stayed on the selling side of it. From merchant, he became a banker. From banker, he became a mine owner. And from mine owner, he became one of the richest men in America. Each rung climbed with the same instinct. Find what scarce men need, corner the supply, and reinvest every dollar into the next venture. Butte, Montana, in the 1880s, was the richest mining hill on earth. Three men fought over it. Marcus Daly controlled the Anaconda mine. F. Augustus Heinze pressed claims through the courts. William Andrews Clark outbought and outspent them both. The three of them were called the Copper Kings, and the wars they waged for control of the Butte mines rank among the most expensive and most corrupt business battles in American history. Clark won. His United Verde mine in Jerome, Arizona, became one of the largest copper producers in the world, yielding over 2 billion pounds of copper, 900,000 ounces of gold, and 33 million ounces of silver across its lifetime. Clark was supplying the raw material that wired America for electricity at the exact moment the country was electrifying itself. But copper was not enough. In 1899, Clark bribed Montana state legislators to buy himself a seat in the United States Senate. A single witness described payoffs of $30,000. The scandal was so brazen that Mark Twain, writing in 1907, called Clark as rotten a human being as can be found anywhere under the flag, and added that his proper place was the penitentiary. Clark resigned on May 15, 1900, rather than face expulsion. The following year he ran again, won on honest votes, and served a single term through 1907. His scandal was not the product of one reckless night. Clark had spent years and large sums cultivating political influence across Montana. The bribery was the round that became public, and the revulsion it produced reached far enough to change the law. The passage of the 17th Amendment in 1913 took the election of United States senators out of the hands of state legislators and gave it to the voters. One man's corruption changed the Constitution. "I never bought a man who wasn't for sale," Clark said. The remark has never been contradicted. Clark poured the copper fortune into real estate, art, and spectacle. On Fifth Avenue in New York, he built a mansion at 962 that took 14 years to complete and cost $7 million. Adjusted to modern values, that figure approaches $242 million. The house rose 9 stories and contained 121 rooms, 31 bathrooms, a 95-foot picture gallery 2 stories high, an organ with 74 ranks, and the gilded salon door, an entire room imported from the Hôtel de Clermont in Paris. Coal arrived on its own underground rail. 35 rooms were set aside for servants. New Yorkers gave it a name that stuck. They called it the Folly. Clark also auctioned 1,200 lots in the Nevada desert for his San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad. The town became Las Vegas. Clark County, Nevada, still bears his name. The fortune was copper at its base, but it had branched into railroads, banking, timber, sugar, and urban real estate across the American West. His art collection rivaled small museums. That 95-foot gallery held works no private citizen had any business owning. Mining output from his properties fed a nation building its electrical grid. Real estate in multiple states compounded year after year. When Clark died in 1925 at the age of 86, the New York Times ran an obituary that filled several columns. He had built one of the largest personal fortunes in the country, and the verdict of his contemporaries was blunt. He earned every dollar. The method of earning made decent people uncomfortable. Less than 2 years after his death, the mansion was demolished. It sold for $3 million and was replaced by a luxury cooperative apartment building designed by Warren and Wetmore and Rosario Candela. 121 rooms, 14 years of construction, $7 million in cost. Gone in under 20 years. The nickname was deserved. But watch what Clark did at the end of his life, because it set the terms for everything that followed. Kate Stauffer, his first wife, bore him 7 children before she died in 1893. His older sons and daughters were settled adults with established families of their own. And then, at the age of 62, Clark married Anna Eugenia Lachapelle in France in 1901. Anna was 23. The gap between them was 39 years. She had been his ward. No marriage certificate or church record has ever been found. 2 daughters followed. Andrea was born in 1902. Huguette Marcel Clark was born in Paris on June 9, 1906, when her father was 67 years old. Andrea, the older of the 2, was 4. The 2 girls grew up together in the shadow of a father who was in his late 60s, running an empire that had made him one of the most disliked and most consequential men in America. A daughter born at the tail end of an old man's life, to a wife young enough to be his granddaughter, inheriting alongside 7 older half-siblings from a prior marriage. That is the succession this story runs on. The builder's final act was not a transition plan. It was a second family, begun late, with no structure beneath it to govern what came next. Huguette Clark grew up in wealth most Americans could not picture. The Fifth Avenue mansion with its 121 rooms, summers at Bellosguardo, the family's 23-acre estate perched above the Pacific in Santa Barbara, lessons in governesses and European travel. She attended the Spence School in Manhattan. At 23, she painted well enough to exhibit 7 works at the Corcoran Gallery in Washington. The talent was real. Loss found her young. Andrea, her older sister, died of meningitis in 1919 at the age of 17. The sisters had been inseparable. People who studied Huguette's life later would point to that death as the wound that shaped everything after it. In 1928, at Bellosguardo, Huguette married William MacDonald Gower. The marriage lasted 2 years. By the family account published decades later, it was never consummated. A divorce came in Reno in August of 1930. Huguette was 24 years old. She never married again. No children followed. And from that point forward, the last direct heir of the Clark copper fortune began, by degrees and then in full, to leave the world behind. Gifted, wealthy beyond measure, possessed of more resources than she could spend in a dozen lifetimes. Yet without interest in living the kind of life her father's generation would have understood. The withdrawal came in stages. First, the society events stopped, then the visits to Bellosguardo. After her mother Anna died in 1963 at 907 Fifth Avenue, Huguette gave the estate staff a standing order: keep everything as it was. Verify the condition through photographs. The gardens were maintained. Every room stayed furnished. 2 cars in the garage, a 1933 Chrysler and a 1933 Cadillac, kept their 1949 license plates into the next century. She was never coming back, but the house was never allowed to change. While Huguette withdrew, the male line of the Clark fortune was vanishing. William Andrews Clark III, called Tertius, died in a plane crash near Clarkdale, Arizona, in 1932. He was 29. Charles Walker Clark died the following year at 61. W. A. Clark Jr., who had founded the Los Angeles Philharmonic, died in 1934 at 57. In 3 years, the male heirs were gone. By 1935, Clark's surviving daughters had sold the United Verde mine holdings to Phelps Dodge for $22.8 million. The copper empire that William Andrews Clark had built was now in someone else's hands. Huguette was the last Clark standing, and she was choosing, year by year, to stand nowhere at all. What she owned and maintained and refused to use became a monument to absence. Bellosguardo sat empty for about 60 years. 23 acres, 22,000 square feet, 1,000 feet of Pacific Ocean frontage, appraised at $85 million, maintained at a cost of $40,000 a month. Grounds were kept, flowers were arranged. The owner never came. Le Beau Chateau in New Canaan, Connecticut, a 9-bedroom estate on 52 acres, had been purchased around 1951 as a Cold War nuclear refuge. Huguette never spent a single night there. Not one night in 62 years of ownership. Property tax alone ran $161,000 a year. At 907 Fifth Avenue, her 3 apartments totaled 42 rooms and 15,000 square feet. The space comprised the entire 8th floor and half the 12th. Staff maintained doll collections in pristine order for an employer they had never met. Those 3 apartments would later sell for a combined $54.8 million. Maintaining 3 properties for a woman who lived in none of them cost close to $1 million a year. Those houses existed as a kind of insurance policy for a life she refused to collect on. Staff was real. Gardens and silver and dolls were cared for with attention and expense. Everything waited for a person who was never going to walk through the door, and everyone involved understood that, and nobody said it. The popular image of Huguette Clark is a helpless old woman trapped and exploited by scheming caretakers. The record tells a different story, and a more unsettling one. She was sharp. She was autonomous. Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr. sent prosecutors to visit her 3 times beginning in August of 2010. Assistant District Attorney Elizabeth Lowy conversed with Clark in both French and English and found, in the official assessment, no signs of delirium or confusion. The investigation was closed without charges. Huguette painted. She ordered antique French dolls from FAO Schwartz by telephone, collecting and maintaining them herself. Episodes of the Flintstones and the Smurfs were recorded and transcribed for her viewing. She wore hospital gowns layered with multiple cashmere sweaters. Her meals consisted of crackers and sardines from a can. This was a life she chose. When a private nurse told her to leave the hospital, Huguette fired her. She registered under the name Harriet Chase and had a fake room number taped to her door. A woman of full mental capacity chose 20 years in a hospital room over 3 maintained mansions worth more than $100 million combined. That fact makes everything that followed far harder to explain away, because the people who moved into the vacuum did so while the woman who created it was watching, aware, and signing every check herself. On March 26, 1991, Huguette Clark checked into Doctors Hospital in Manhattan for treatment of a basal cell carcinoma on her face. She was 84. The physicians who examined her described her condition as looking like somebody out of a concentration camp. Surgery followed. She recovered. And then she stayed. Her physician urged her to go home. She told the staff she was happy, content to remain. She paid out of her own pocket $829 a day, rising over the years to close to $1,200. Painting filled her mornings. Dolls were ordered and tended. Cartoons played on a small screen. For 20 years, that room was her home. Hadassah Perry was assigned as the daytime private nurse in the spring of 1991. Over the next 2 decades, she received gifts from Huguette Clark totaling $31,906,074.81, 5 houses, a Bentley. For her son, a Stradivarius violin valued at $1.2 million. When Huguette sold a Cezanne for $15 million, the proceeds came in 3 checks of $5 million each. Perry cashed 2. While the gifts accumulated on the third floor of Beth Israel, 3 properties sat furnished and silent across 3 states, maintained at close to $1 million a year for a woman who lived in none of them. Isolation did not produce a void. It created an opportunity, and 3 people filled it. Nurse Perry accumulated $31.9 million in lifetime gifts. Lawyer Wallace Bach solicited $1.5 million from his own client for a personal construction project overseas. Accountant Irving Kamsler was convicted in 2008 of attempting to disseminate indecent material to minors. No jail time. He continued working as Huguette Clark's certified public accountant. Between them, Bach and Kamsler had failed to file federal gift tax returns for gifts totaling close to $56 million. The Internal Revenue Service assessed a total liability exceeding $82 million. Bill Dedman, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, discovered the story in 2009 while browsing Connecticut real estate listings. His investigative series for NBC drew more than 110 million page views. The book he wrote with Paul Clark Newell Jr., Huguette's first cousin once removed, was published in 2013 as Empty Mansions. At the center of everything that followed stood a 6-week gap. On March 7th, 2005, Huguette Clark, aged 98, signed a will in her hospital room. It left $5 million to her nurse and the remainder of the estate to 21 relatives. 6 weeks later, on April 19th, she signed a second will in the same room. This one cut her family out. The language left no room for interpretation. I intentionally make no provision in this, my last will and testament, for any members of my family, whether on my paternal or maternal side, having had minimal contact with them over the years. The second will sent close to 75% to the Bellosguardo Foundation and the Corcoran Gallery. About $30 million went to Nurse Perry, $500,000 each to Bach and Kamsler. To the family, nothing. Either her mind had changed of its own accord, or someone had changed it for her. In December of 2011, Manhattan surrogate Kristen Booth Glenn suspended Bach and Kamsler from the estate, citing gross negligence. Everyone who tells this story arrives at the same question. What did Huguette Clark lose? If the answer is dollars, nothing. On May 24th, 2011, she died at Beth Israel Medical Center in Manhattan at the age of 104, holding a fortune north of $300 million. She was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in a private entombment conducted before the cemetery gates opened for the day. She had requested no funeral service. The money did not disappear. What was lost was a life. The Clark Copper empire ended with a woman who chose one hospital room over 3 mansions, a Stradivarius, and $300 million. 19 distant relatives challenged the second will in Manhattan surrogates court. Half grandnieces and grandnephews, descendants of the 7 children William Andrews Clark had fathered with his first wife. Most had not seen Huguette since 1957. Many had never met her. The argument they brought was undue influence. In their telling, the inner circle had manipulated a reclusive and isolated elderly woman into disinheriting her own blood. The case was assigned to Judge Nora S. Anderson. Lawyers on both sides expected it to be long and hard fought. It never reached a jury. A settlement was approved on September 24th, 2013, 5 days after jury selection had begun. The 19 relatives received $34.5 million, tax-free. Nurse Perry received nothing from the estate and returned an uncashed check of $5 million dated May 1st, 2000. Of the lifetime gifts, she retained close to $26 million. Bach and Kamsler forfeited all bequests and executor roles. A criminal investigation was opened and closed without charges. Total legal fees consumed close to $25 million. Judge Anderson called the outcome a fair result. The Clark Copper dynasty ended not in bankruptcy, but in extinction. Children there were none. Direct heirs, none. Clark County, Nevada, and the Los Angeles Philharmonic, founded by William Andrews Clark Jr., are the public traces that survive. The bloodline holds nothing. The question is not complicated to state. How does a fortune this large, held by one person for close to a century, end up fought over by distant relatives who had almost no contact with its owner, while the woman who held it spent her last 20 years alone in a hospital room, paying out of her own pocket for the privilege of solitude? The answer is not greed, nor is it incompetence. The prosecutors who visited Huguette Clark confirmed she was neither confused nor coerced. The answer is isolation itself. When a person withdraws from the world in full, she does not become invisible. She becomes a target. The people who remain closest are, by definition, the people willing to stay when everyone else has gone. And their reasons for staying are not always what they appear to be. Huguette Clark had no family office, no trust protector, no board of advisors. Not a single disinterested party reviewed the checks she signed or the gifts she gave. Perry was the only person who saw her every day. Bach was the only person who managed her legal affairs. Kamsler was the only person who filed her taxes. Each of them operated in a space where no one else was watching, and each of them profited from that solitude in ways the court would later describe as egregious. Bach solicited money from his own client for his personal project overseas. Kamsler continued handling her finances after a criminal conviction for attempting to disseminate indecent material to minors. And Perry received $31.9 million in gifts from a woman who had no one else to give them to. There is a specific mechanism at work, and it is worth naming. A fortune surrounded by many people develops natural checks. Advisors question each other. Family members notice large transfers. Lawyers answer to other lawyers. But strip away every layer except the innermost one, and the last people standing become the only voices in the room. Those voices set the terms. Those voices draft the documents and file the returns, or fail to file them. And the person at the center, however sharp her mind, hears only what those voices choose to say. The court's finding of undue influence was the legal term for that human truth. Isolation does not protect a fortune. It is the condition that allows other people to dismantle it, one gift and one signature at a time, while the person signing believes she is choosing of her own accord. Huguette Clark gave away close to $32 million to a single nurse. She signed every check. The isolation did not prevent the loss. It invited the people who would carry it out. What structure looks like, built after the damage has been done, stands on a cliff above the Pacific in Santa Barbara. The Bellosguardo Foundation was established under the terms of Huguette Clark's second will. It took 7 years to bring into existence. Because the will was contested, the Internal Revenue Service assessed more than $82 million in back taxes, and no property could transfer until all of it was resolved. A foundation board had to be assembled to receive a 23-acre oceanfront estate with a 22,000 square foot mansion on it, and no operating budget to speak of. In 2014, the foundation was created. 4 years after that, the property transferred. Dick Wolf, the television producer who created the Law & Order franchise, agreed to chair the board. Consider what the foundation inherited. A French-style mansion built in 1933 after the original was damaged in the 1925 Santa Barbara earthquake. 23 acres of manicured grounds running 1,000 feet along the Pacific coast, a carriage house with 2 automobiles inside, a 1933 Chrysler Royal 8 convertible, and a 1933 Cadillac limousine, both covered in cloth, both still carrying their 1949 California license plates. The gardens had been maintained for 6 decades at $40,000 a month. The rooms were furnished as Huguette's mother had left them in 1963, because Huguette had given the staff a standing order never to change a thing, and she checked the condition through photographs mailed to her hospital room. Every object in the house had been preserved with extraordinary care by people who had never met their employer, for an owner who would never walk through the door at an annual cost that exceeded what most Americans earn in a decade. And for 60 years, the purpose of all that preservation was nothing. The house existed to wait. That was its entire function. The foundation changed that function. Public tours began in 2023. Full programming permits were approved in 2025 by the Santa Barbara Planning Commission. Visitors now walk through the rooms Huguette's staff preserved, and Huguette refused to enter. Automobiles with their 1949 plates are stops on a guided tour. Gardens are a park above the ocean. Bellosguardo is the named winner in this story for one reason. It is the one entity connected to the Clark fortune that gave Huguette's wealth a purpose she never provided. What she maintained out of habit or grief, or some private logic nobody alive can explain, the foundation converted into a public trust. A board of directors oversees the property. Public events bring revenue. Docents explain the history. Every function that Huguette Clark refused to perform for her own fortune, a foundation now performs on her behalf and in her name. What Huguette Clark never built for herself was built after she died, and it works. Consider the Vanderbilts, who burned through the largest fortune in America in 3 generations through spending, or the Astors, who lost theirs through division and an obsession with social standing that replaced the instinct to build. Against them, the Rockefellers, who kept theirs through trusts and a family office that still guards the fortune across generations of heirs. In every case, the pattern is the same. Families that endure treat the fortune as an institution. Families that fade treat it as a private matter. The Clarks did not overspend. They did not divide the money among squabbling heirs. The last person who held it walked out of the room, and nobody with any reason to protect the fortune was standing at the door. Huguette Clark was a painter who exhibited at the Corcoran Gallery, a collector whose antique French dolls were worth fortunes in their own right. By the testimony of prosecutors who visited her in her hospital room, a woman of sharp mind and undimmed intelligence at 104, she was not a fool, and she was not a victim. She was a person who chose not to participate in the world she had inherited, and in that withdrawal, she left the fortune with no defender except the people who were already taking from it. Her father had started with 20-cent eggs sold for $3 to Montana miners. His daughter ended with sardines from a can in a room that cost $829 a day. The distance between those two lives is the distance between a man who seized everything the world had to offer and a woman who refused everything the world tried to give her. One built a fortune from nothing. The other held a fortune and chose nothing. The mansions are no longer empty. Bellosguardo has visitors now. The grounds Huguette paid $40,000 a month to preserve without visiting are a park above the ocean. Her fortune found a purpose its owner never gave it. The Clark copper line is gone. There is no heir and no dynasty. There is a building on a cliff, a foundation with a board of directors, and a question that $300 million and 104 years of life could not answer. What is a fortune for if the person who holds it refuses to live?